African American history is the time of American history that specifically discusses the African American or Black American ethnic groups in the United States. Most African Americans are the descendants of Africans forcibly brought to and held captive in the United States from 1555 to 1865. Blacks from the Caribbean whose ancestors immigrated, or who immigrated to the U.S. also traditionally have been considered African American, as they share a common history of predominantly West African or Central African roots. The Middle Passage and slavery. African Americans have been known by various names throughout American history, including colored and Negro, which are no longer accepted in English. Instead, the most usual and accepted terms nowadays are African American and Black, which however may have different connotations. The term person of color usually refers not only to African Americans, but also to other non-white ethnic groups, others who sometimes are referred to as African Americans, and who may identify themselves as such in U.S. government censuses, include relatively recent Black immigrants from Africa, South America and elsewhere. African American history is celebrated and highlighted annually in the United States during February, designated as Black History Month. Although previously marginalized, African American history has gained ground in school and university curricula and gained wider scholarly attention since the late 20th century. African origins. The great majority of African Americans descend from Africans brought directly from Africa. Originally, these slaves were captured in African wars and transported via the Atlantic slave trade. The American slaves descended from the various ethnic groups from mostly Western and Central Africa, including the Sahel. A smaller minority were from Eastern and Southeastern Africa, including the Hausa, Tuareg, Fula, Akongad, Igbo, Mande, Wolof, Akan, Fon, Yoruba, and Makua amongst others. Although these different groups varied in customs, religious theology and language, what they had in common was a way of life that was different from the Europeans. However, since a majority of the slaves came from these villages and societies, once sent to the Americas, these different peoples had European standards and beliefs forced upon them, causing them to do away with tribal differences and forged a new history and culture that was a creolization of the common pasts, present, and European culture. Slaves from specific African ethnic groups were more sought after and more dominant in numbers than others in certain regions of what later became the United States. Regions of Africa. Studies of contemporary documents reveal 7 regions from which Africans were sold or taken during the Atlantic slave trade. These regions were Senegambia, encompassing the coast from the Senegal River to the Casamance River, where captives as far away as the upper and middle Niger River Valley were sold. The Sierra Leone region included territory from the Casamance to the ISNI River in the modern countries of Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia and Côte d'Ivoire. The Gold Coast region consisted of mainly modern Ghana. The Bight of Benin region stretched from the Volta River to the Benue River in modern Togo, Benin and southwestern Nigeria. The Bight of Biafra extended from southeastern Nigeria through Cameroon into Gabon. West Central Africa, the largest region, included the Congo and Angola, and East and Southeast Africa. The region of Mozambique-Madagascar included the modern countries of Mozambique, parts of Tanzania and Madagascar. The largest source of slaves to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean for the New World was West Africa. Some West Africans were skilled iron workers and were therefore able to make tools that aided in their agricultural labor, While there were many unique tribes with their own customs and religions by the 10th century, Islam had been soaked up by many of the residents and became a common religion. Those villages in West Africa that were lucky enough to be in good conditions for growth and success prospered. They also contributed the success to the slave trade. Origins and percentages of African Americans imported into British North America and Louisiana of the Middle Passage. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were already people of African descent in America. A few countries in Africa would buy, sell, and trade other enslaved Africans, who were often prisoners of war, with the Europeans. The people of Mali and Benin are known for partaking in the event of selling the prisoners of war and other unwanted people off as slaves. Transport. In the account of O Lord Requiano, he described the process of being transported to the colonies and being on the slave ships as a horrific experience. On the ships, the slaves were separated from the family long before they boarded the ships. Once aboard the ships, the captives were then segregated by gender. Under the deck, the slaves were cramped and did not have enough space to walk around freely. Male slaves were generally kept in the ship's hold, where they experienced the worst of crowding. The captives stationed on the floor beneath low-lying bunks could barely move and spent much of the voyage pinned to the floorboards, which could, over time, wear the skin on their elbows down to the bone. Due to the lack of basic hygiene, malnourishment, and dehydration, diseases spread wildly and death was common. The women on the ships often endured rape by the crewmen. Women and children were often kept in rooms set apart from the main hold. This gave crewmen easy access to the women, which was often regarded as one of the perks of the trade system. Not only did these rooms give the crewmen easy access to women, but it gave enslaved women better access to information on the ship's crew, fortifications, and daily routine, but little opportunity to communicate this to the men confined in the ship's hold. As an example, women instigated a 1797 insurrection aboard the British ship Thomas by stealing weapons and passing them to the men below, as well as engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the ship's crew. In the midst of these terrible conditions, African slaves plotted mutiny. Male slaves were the most likely candidates to mutiny, and only at times they were on deck. While rebellions did not happen often, they were usually unsuccessful. In order for the crew members to keep the slaves under control and prevent future rebellions, the crews were often twice as large, and members would instill fear into the slaves through brutality and harsh punishments. For the time of being captured in Africa to the arrival to the plantations of the European masters took an average of 6 months. Africans were completely cut off from the families, home, and community life. They were forced to adjust to a new way of life. Early African American history. The first African slaves were brought to Point Comfort, today's Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, 30 miles downstream from Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The English settlers treated these captives as indentured servants and released them after a number of years. This practice was gradually replaced by the system of race-based slavery used in the Caribbean. As servants were freed, they became competition for resources. Additionally, released servants had to be replaced. This, combined with the still ambiguous nature of the social status of blacks and the difficulty in using any other group of people as forced servants, led to the relegation of blacks into slavery. Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize slavery in 1641. Other colonies followed suit by passing laws that passed slavery on to the children, if slaves, and making non-Christian imported servants slaves for life. Africans first arrived in 1619, when a Dutch ship sold 19 blacks as indentured servants to Englishmen at Point Comfort, 30 miles downstream from Jamestown, Virginia. In all, about 10 to 12 million Africans were transported to the Western Hemisphere. The vast majority of these people came from that stretch of the West African coast extending from present-day Senegal to Angola. A small percentage came from Madagascar and East Africa. Only 5% went to the American colonies. The vast majority went to the West Indies and Brazil, where they died quickly. Demographic conditions were highly favorable in the American colonies, with less disease, more food, some medical care, and lighter workloads than prevailed in the sugar fields. At first, the Africans in the South were outnumbered by white indentured servants who came voluntarily from Britain. They avoided the plantations. With the vast amount of good land and the shortage of laborers, plantation owners turned to lifetime slaves who worked for the keep but were not paid wages and could not easily escape. Slaves had some legal rights. Generally, the slaves developed their own family system, religion and customs in the slave quarters with little interference from owners, who were only interested in work outputs. Before the 1660s, the North American mainland colonies were expanding, but still fairly small in size and did not have a great demand for labor. So the colonists did not import large numbers of African slaves at this point. By 1700 there were 25,000 black slaves in the North American mainland colonies, about 10% of the population. Some had been shipped directly from Africa, but initially, very often they had been shipped via the West Indies in small cargoes after spending time working on the islands. At the same time, many, increasingly, were native-born on the North American mainland. Their legal status was now clear. They were slaves for life and so were the children of slave mothers. They could be sold, or freed, and a few ran away, some using the Underground Railroad to reach freedom. In the eyes of the slave owner, they were no more than livestock. As white settlers began to claim and clear more land for large-scale farming and plantations, the number of slaves imported directly from Africa began to rapidly increase in large numbers between the 1660s and into the 1700s onward, since the trade in slaves coming in from the West Indies was much too small to meet the huge demand for the now fast-growing North American mainland slave market. Additionally, most American slave buyers no longer wanted slaves coming in from the West Indies. By now they were either harder to obtain, too expensive, undesirable, or more often, ruined in many ways by the very brutal regime of the island sugar plantations. By the end of the 17th century, a relaxation on colonial tax laws, and the removal of royal monopolies by the British Crown made the direct slave trade with Africa much easier. As a result, freshly imported, young, and healthy Africans were now much more affordable, cheaper in price, and more readily available in large numbers to American slave buyers who by now preferred to purchase them, even if it took some time for them to adjust to a new life as plantation slaves. From about 1700 to 1859, the majority of slaves imported to the North American mainland came directly from Africa in huge cargoes to fill a massive spike in demand for much-needed labor to work the continually expanding plantations in the southern colonies, with most heading to Virginia, South Carolina, and French or Spanish Louisiana. Unlike in the South, the northern colonies developed into much more urbanized and industrialized societies, and they relied less on agriculture as a main economy, so therefore they did not import many African slaves, and the black population that remained fairly low for a very long time. However, big northern cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston had relatively large black populations for most of the colonial period and thereafter. For the 1750s, American-born slaves of African descent already began to outnumber African-born slaves. By the time of the American Revolution, most of the northern states had abolished and banned slavery. and some southern states like Virginia had produced such large and self-sustaining locally born slave populations by natural increase, that they stopped taking in direct imports of slaves from Africa altogether. However, other southern states like Georgia and South Carolina still relied on constant, fresh supplies of slave labor to keep up with the demand of the burgeoning plantation economies, so they continued to allow the direct importation of slaves from Africa right up to 1808, only stopping for a few years in the 1770s, because of a temporary lull in the trade brought on by the American Revolutionary War. The continued, direct importation of slaves from Africa ensured that for most of the 18th century, South Carolina's black population remained very high, with blacks outnumbering whites 3 to 1, unlike in Virginia, which had a white majority. Despite its large black slave population, it was said that South Carolina in the 18th century as a British colony looked much more like an extension of West Africa than it did of Britain. All legal, direct importation of slaves from Africa had stopped by 1808, when the now newly formed United States finally banned its citizens from participating in the international slave trade altogether by law. Despite the ban, small to moderate cargoes of slaves were occasionally being illegally shipped into the United States directly from Africa for many years, as late as 1859. Slowly a free black population emerged, concentrated in port cities along the Atlantic coast from Charleston to Boston. Slaves in the cities and towns had many more privileges, but the great majority of slaves lived on southern tobacco or rice plantations, usually in groups of 20 or more. Wealthy plantation owners eventually would become so reliant on slavery that they devastated their own lower class. In years to come, the institution of slavery would be so heavily involved in the South's economy it would divide America into two opposing forces. The most serious slave rebellion was the Stono Uprising, in September 1739 in South Carolina. The colony had about 56,000 slaves, who outnumbered whites 2 to 1. About 150 slaves rose up and, seizing guns and ammunition, murdered 20 whites, and headed for Spanish Florida. The local militia soon intercepted and killed most of them. All the American colonies had slavery, but it was usually the form of personal servants in the North, and field hands in plantations in the South. These statistics show the early imbalance that would eventually tip the scale and rid the United States of slavery. The Revolution and early America. The later half of the 18th century was a time of political upheaval in the United States. In the midst of cries for relief from British rule, people pointed out the apparent hypocrisies of slaveholders demanding freedom. The Declaration of Independence, a document that would become a manifesto for human rights and personal freedom, was written by Thomas Jefferson, who owned over 200 slaves. Other Southern statesmen were also major slaveholders. The Second Continental Congress did consider freeing slaves to disrupt British commerce. They removed language from the Declaration of Independence that included the promotion of slavery amongst the offenses of King George III. A number of free blacks, most notably Prince Hall, the founder of Prince Hall Freemasonry, submitted petitions for the end of slavery, but these petitions were largely ignored. This did not deter blacks, free and slave, from participating in the Revolution. Crispus Attucks, a free black tradesman, was the first casualty of the Boston Massacre and of the ensuing American Revolutionary War. 5,000 blacks, including Prince Hall, fought in the Continental Army. Many fought side by side with white soldiers at the battles of Lexington and Concord and at Bunker Hill. But when George Washington took command in 1775, he barred any further recruitment of blacks. Approximately 5,000 free African American men helped the American colonists in the struggle for freedom. One of these men, Agrippa Hull, fought in the American Revolution for over 6 years. He and the other African American soldiers fought in order to improve the white neighbors' views of them and advance their own fight of freedom. By contrast, the British and Loyalists offered emancipation to any slave owned by a patriot who was willing to join the Loyalist forces. Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, recruited 300 African American men into his Ethiopian regiment within a month of making this proclamation. In South Carolina, 25,000 slaves, more than 1/4 of the total, escaped to join and fight with the British, or fled for freedom in the uproar of war. Thousands of slaves also escaped in Georgia and Virginia, as well as New England and New York. Well-known black Loyalist soldiers include Colonel Pyle and Boston King. The Americans eventually won the war. In the Provisional Treaty, they demanded the return of property, including slaves. Nonetheless, the British helped up to 4,000 documented African Americans to leave the country for Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and Britain rather than be returned to slavery. Thomas Peters was one of the large numbers of African Americans who fought for the British. Peters was born in present-day Nigeria and belonged to the Yoruba tribe, and ended up being captured and sold into slavery in French Louisiana. Sold again, he became a slave in North Carolina and escaped his master's farm in order to receive Lord Dunmore's promises of freedom. Peters fought for the British throughout the war. When the war finally ended, he and other African Americans who fought on the losing side were taken to Nova Scotia. Here, they were given pieces of land that they could not farm. They also did not receive the same freedoms as white Englishmen. Peters sailed to London in order to complain to the government. He arrived at a momentous time, when English abolitionists were pushing a bill through Parliament to charter the Sierra Leone Company and to grant trading and settlement rights on the West African coast. Peters and the other African Americans on Nova Scotia left for Sierra Leone in 1792. Peters died soon after they arrived, but the other members of his party lived on in the new home. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 sought to define the foundation for the government of the newly formed United States of America. The Constitution set forth the ideals of freedom and equality while providing for the continuation of the institution of slavery through the Fugitive Slave Clause and the Three-Fifths Compromise. Additionally, free blacks' rights were also restricted in many places. Most were denied the right to vote and were excluded from public schools. Some blacks sought to fight these contradictions in court. In 1780, Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker used language from the new Massachusetts Constitution that declared all men were born free and equal in freedom. Suits to gain release from slavery. A free black businessman in Boston named Paul Cuff sought to be excused from paying tax since he had no voting rights. In the northern states, the revolutionary spirit did help African Americans. Beginning in the 1750s, there was widespread sentiment during the American Revolution that slavery was a social evil that should eventually be abolished. All the northern states passed Emancipation Acts between 1780 and 1804. Most of these arranged for gradual emancipation and a special status for freedmen, so there were still a dozen permanent apprentices into the 19th century. In 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance and barred slavery from the large Northwest Territory. In 1790, there were more than 59,000 free blacks in the United States. By 1810, that number had risen to 186,446. Most of these were in the North, but revolutionary sentiments also motivated Southern slaveholders. For 20 years after the Revolution, more Southerners also freed slaves, sometimes by manumission or in wills to be accomplished after the slaveholder's death. In the Upper South, the percentage of free blacks rose from about 1% before the Revolution to more than 10% by 1810. Quakers and Moravians worked to persuade slaveholders to free families. In Virginia, the number of free blacks increased from 10,000 in 1790 to nearly 30,000 in 1810, but 95% of blacks were still enslaved. In Delaware, 3/4 of all blacks were free by 1810. By 1860, just over 91% of Delaware's blacks were free, and 49.1% of those in Maryland. Among the successful free men was Benjamin Banneker, a Maryland astronomer, mathematician, almanac author, surveyor and farmer, who in 1791 assisted in the initial survey of the boundaries of the future District of Columbia. Despite the challenges of living in the new country, most free blacks fared far better than the nearly 800,000 enslaved blacks. Even so, many considered emigrating to Africa. Religion. By 1800, a small number of slaves had joined Christian churches. Free blacks in the North had set up networks of churches, and in the South the slaves sat in the upper gallery. Central to the growth of community among blacks was the black church, usually the first community institution to be established. The black church was both an expression of community and unique African American spirituality, and a reaction to discrimination. The church also served as neighborhood centers where free black people could celebrate their African heritage without intrusion by white detractors. The church also the center of education. Since the church was part of the community and wanted to provide education, they educated the freed and enslaved blacks. Seeking autonomy, some blacks like Richard Allen founded separate black denominations. The Second Great Awakening has been called the central and defining event in the development of Afro-Christianity.